So I wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Sanjot Mehendale, and as the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, I would like to welcome you to today's conference entitled Ruling Together, Consultation and Collaboration in the Political Regimes of Pre-Modern Eurasia. I'm very happy to see many of you here on a Friday before a holiday weekend. Before I introduce the organizers, I just wanted to say a few words about the P.Y. and Kim May W. Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. It was founded in 2017 by a generous gift from the Tang family with the idea to advance multi-regional, multidisciplinary, and trans-border research and teaching under a Silk Road rubric. To date, we have organized several successful conferences, workshops, colloquium series. We've also supported graduate student research, faculty research trips, and publications. We're also collaborating with the Asian Art Museum on an exhibition. Although our work takes us into various geographical directions, the center concentrates its efforts primarily on the heartland of Eurasia, what one might define as Central Eurasia or Inner Asia, including Western China, the former Soviet republics of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, as well as Mongolia and Afghanistan, simultaneously recognizing the important role that maritime routes played in connecting Asia to other parts of the world. Now, the seemingly amorphous, broad approach is centered by these annual activities that tackle a particular theme, such as the one today, which is really the brainchild of Kaveh Hemmat and Frank Billet. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Frank and Kaveh. Kaveh, very briefly, there'll be a second introduction to his work as well. So Frank Billet is the program director of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. He obtained his degree in social anthropology from Cambridge University, and his work lies at the intersection of cartography, sovereignty, and territoriality. This research interest has led to a number of book projects, both single-authored and collective, organized around the theoretical foci of the volumetric, the corporeal, and the topological. So in progress are Somatic States on Cartography, Geobodies, Bodily Integrity, which will be published by Duke University Press. Forthcoming is Writing in the Negative Space of the State, which is co-edited with Lisa Min and Charlene Mackley by Punctum Books. And for us, for our center, he's the co-editor of the Maritime Silk Roads, Global Connectivity, Regional Nodes, Materiality, which was published by Amsterdam University Press. Kaveh Hemmat is Associate Professor of History and Global Studies at Benedictine University, and his work focuses on representations and perceptions of East Asia in Islamic culture. His current book project, The 100 Kings of Samarkand, Silk Road, Civic Love, and the Ottoman Book of China, will be the first monograph focused on the question of how East Asia was perceived and represented in Islamic culture. He also has a book manuscript in progress entitled The 100 Kings of Samarkand, Silk Road, Civic Love, and the Ottoman Book of China. For now, please help me welcome Frank Billet, who will introduce the conference.
Thank you, Sanjot, for these remarks and for the introductions. My co-organizer, Kaveh Hemmat, and I are delighted to welcome you to our conference, Ruling Together, Consultation and Collaboration in the Political Regimes of Pre-Modern Eurasia. We are excited to have with us today a stellar cast of scholars, and we look forward to a wonderful exchange of ideas. The origin point of the conference, very much in line with the mission of the Tang Center, is to foreground the Eurasian landmass as a cultural region in its own right. Through the Silk Road framework, Central Asia has typically been envisioned as a vast, diffuse market and space of cross-cultural contact, in which objects and ideas spread gradually through far-flung, interlocking networks of trade or diplomatic contact. Our focus today will instead be political institutions, especially those involving collaborative governance, consultation, or condominial sovereignty. through which rulers, ruling classes, or states integrated diverse regions or political cultures into coherent units of stable coalitions. Thinking of Eurasia as a space of encounter rather than a territory connected and divided by political and cultural systems tends to downplay agency and ideology, reducing interactions to chance encounters. Instead, we aim to emphasize the spatiality of political institutions, how formal or informal rule systems were embedded in and reinforced certain interpretations of space. We hope that this conference will contribute to the integration of the study of trans-regional and cross-cultural contact with the study of political history and to the appreciation of Central Asia as a theater of medieval and early modern global political history. So for this conference, we are allocating just 30 minutes per speaker in order to have time for questions at the end of each session. We really want to have the space for discussion in order to really kind of bring all these ideas together. So I'll briefly introduce the speakers now instead of having to go back and forth. I think it's going to be kind of easier. So our first speaker is going to be Christopher Atwood, who's maybe doesn't need an introduction. He's professor of Mongolian and Chinese history and ethnic history and also department chair at the University of Pennsylvania School of Arts and Science. His research centers on the relation of culture, especially history, writing, and religion, and the formation of political power among the Mongols. His first major research project was on 20th century Mongolian nationalism in Inner Mongolia and its interaction with Chinese state building in the late Qing and Republican period. His current major projects include the multi-ethnic and multilingual historiography of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Empire, its religious and personnel policy, and the early modern. Other topics he has been writing on include the social history of mobile pastoralism with a focus on Mongolia in the Qing period, and using philological methods to read against the grain of Chinese sources and shed light on the institutional history of pre-Mongol and pre-Turkic in Eurasia. Our second speaker is Michael Bechtel, who is assistant professor of history at Nazarbayev University, teaching the history of Kazakhstan, the Mongol Empire, the Ming and Qing Empire. Currently working on a biography of Ogodei, a comparative study of pastoral nomadic congress, and other research related to his recent dissertation on collective sovereignty in the reign of Ogodei and his successors. Other projects of his include the development of the Kazakhstan-Mongolia Oral History Project. Our third speaker would be joining us on Zoom is Jonathan Brack, who's a historian of medieval and early modern Iran and the Mongol Empire. His research focuses on religious exchanges, conversion, and comparative empires. His first book is An Afterlife for the Khan, Muslims, Buddhists, and Sacred Kinship in Mongol Iran and Eurasia, which came out with University of California Press in 2023. He co-edited as well the volume Along the Silk Roads in Mongol Eurasia, Generals, Merchants, and Intellectuals, which came out in 2020 with University of California Press as well. The last speaker is Evrim Bimbash. He received his PhD degree from the University of Chicago. After 7 years at Royal Holloway at the University of London, he moved to the Institute of Oriental and Asian Studies at the University of Bonn. He studies early modern Islamic history with a particular focus on the Timurid and Turkmen dynasties in the 15th century. His first book on the Timurid historian Sharaf al-Din al-Yazdi was published by Cambridge University Press and was called Intellectual Networks in Timurid Iran, Sharaf al-Din al-Yazdi and the Islamic Republic of Letters. Intellectual Networks in Timurid Iran shared the 2017 British Kuwait Friendship Society Prize in Middle Eastern Studies and the 2018 Association for Iranian Studies Said Sirjani Book Prize Honorable Mention Award. He was also shortlisted for the 2017 Gladstone Prize by the Royal Historical Society in Britain and the 2017-2018 Book of the Year Award in Iranian Studies by the National Library and Archives of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Currently, Evrim is working on 3 different book projects. Together with John E. Woods at the University of Chicago, he is preparing critical edition of Yazdi's Yael al-Zafarnama, which is the second and so far unpublished volume of the Zafarnama. He is also editing, again together with John E. Woods, a handbook on the Timurid dynasty titled The Timurid Dynasty, a Handbook. His book This book was commissioned by Brill in Leiden, and when it is published, it will include contributions from more than 30 scholars working on early modern Islamic history. Finally, it's preparing a monograph on the modality of sovereignty. In his new monograph, Bimbash highlights the non-monarchical and divided forms of sovereignty in the early modern Islamic period. So here we are. We are going to start with Professor Atwood.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and I want to thank Frank and Kevin for inviting me. And this project is, you know, as they say, it's a work in progress. Also, for various reasons, I have a little bit less time to develop it than I might have wanted, so I hope Frank will keep me on time. I do want to stick within my 30 minutes. So one of the interesting features of the Mongol Empire that I think at least it's my impression, people have just kind of taken it for granted, are these unbelievably long interregna periods in the early Mongol Empire. So I decided to do a little bit of quantification. I created a database in which I looked at how long these interregna are. First of all, I did it just in terms of different, for the Unified Empire, the Yuan Dynasty, and the Ilkhanate, I put them all in order of what they happened, and this is what it looks like in terms of months. We're talking the longest one is over 72 months, and some of the shortest one was after Aragorn killed Teguder and then literally the next day he was crowned. So that's from 1 day to 72 months. But it's interesting if you separate them out and have unified empire, and then in the sort of orange Yuan Dynasty and in the gray Ilkhanate, you get a very interesting different picture. The unified empire is kind of off the charts. It's much longer, although by the end of it, you may notice there is something, it's also long. I also did a little bit of analysis in terms of by type of how did the previous ruler die, and then these are average lengths, not them. So when in the unified empire, if the ruler died sort of roughly in his homeland, then it was about 49 weeks and so on. But if he died in campaign, it was rather shorter. And then we see a similar sort of pattern, or opposite pattern for the Yuan and for the Ilkhanate. So this was a little bit, and we don't have a large number of, N is kind of small. We don't have a large number of cases. So I decided to simplify it a little bit. Here what we can see is that violent death produces definitely short interregna. Let's get this. Yeah, so violent death produces short interregna. If we combine the Yuan and the Ilkhanate together, the successor states, we have actually a kind of fairly coherent picture. Violent death produces short interregna, generally speaking, about a half a month on average. In other words, if somebody offs the previous Khan, there's a real sense that we got to move quickly to get a new guy on the throne. But if it happens with a natural death, it's much longer. It's about 4 months and 10 days on average in the successor states. But once again, the unified empire, and here I've kind of combined, I removed the distinction between natural death on campaign and natural death in the or at home to just say natural versus violent. So there is none of the unified emperor Khans died by violence, so that doesn't really, we don't have that distinction. But the unified empire interregna are off the charts, and they're also the only ones that are stated to have had a regent in charge. Sometimes after Chinggis Khan, it's stated to have been Tolui, and then certainly after Ögedei, it's stated to have been his empress Turgene, and after Guyuk, his empress Ogulhamish. So I think these two go together, and this is roughly what I'm trying to explain in this paper. Two big issues. Why did the unified empire have such enormously long interregna? Second, why did they appoint regents? And I think these two probably go together. In other words, an explanation that explains both of these is likely to be more satisfying than one that only explains one of them. And so I decided, where's the answer going to come from? I decided to take a look at the first post-Chinggis interregnum, that after Chinggis Khan died. Basically, to recap, we're trying to explain why are the interregna so long, and why do they have regents, and I'm going to take a look at the immediate time after Chinggis Khan to sort of explain this. And so there's going to be something of a narrative study. Another aim of this research is also to explore what is actually a really strange period, and it's actually one that is highly. Can you still hear me?
Oh, you're good.
Yeah. Okay. So, so it's also one that and there's a lot of interesting events which have not been pulled together before. So it's also a bit of a narrative study of the first interregnum. All right, so one of the first things I want to talk about here is a Kurultai, and there was a debate about this that I engaged with Igor Durakovilts in his study of the dating and the secrets to the Mongols. It's not really a whole lot of relevant, but I just wanted to announce my position that normally something like a Kurultai, some kind of meeting of princes took place basically twice a year. But it wasn't necessarily regular, and I've also just recently, this is a little bit predating Monkherdin's wonderful study of the Cholguns, which would, I think, broadly support this, although, again, he said they were really, these meetings were really common, but there was not very, not super, not regular. But generally speaking, and this goes back to Sofia Kubzinska-Savartz's study of the games of the Mongol shepherds. It's an old book, but it's still a golden oldie. Talks about, generally speaking, there are assemblies in Mongolia tend to take place in two seasons. One in the winter, around what's now Tsagansar, and then the other in the summer. And what today is called Nadam. But what's interesting is that the occasions vary. It can be a religious occasion, it can be a Kurultai, it can be celebrating Mongolian independence, a revolution, something like that. But what you do on it is all pretty much the same. So it's kind of interesting. The occasions change, but it generally stays but the seasonality is the same. And that seasonality is related to military seasonality, which is, and this is something also, another topic very much worthy of discussion, which is that in the Mongol Empire, seasonality of campaigns is very strongly marked. All campaigns essentially start in what is now what we consider autumn, basically October, November, and they all end by April. Basically from April to September, October, it is freakishly unusual for the Mongols to have a campaign. There are some exceptions, but it's extremely unusual. So, and therefore the summer assembly is one where you plan what the campaign is going to be like. All right, so now the post-Chinggis Kurultai was not the first Kurultai. There are previous ones that are mentioned in the sources. Interesting, one classic example is from the Secrets to the Mongols in section 57, 58. After Hambagay Khan was killed, it reads, since Hambagay Khan had named Khadan and Khotala in sending the message, so the Khan had been killed by the Altan Khan, the Golden Khan of the Jurchen. So he sends to a group of sort of distant cousins, basically saying Khotala and Khadan, who are distant cousins of each other, you guys avenge my death. And then, so they have a Kurultai, they dance around, they have all this feasting and so on, and then they elect one of them, and then they ride off against the Tatars who had handed him over to the Golden Khan. Interesting enough, however, Rashid ad-Din actually records both the secret history of the Mongols' version of this story, and then he also records a different one in which Hambagay Khan sends a message to them, and he sends a message to the Taichot, and they can't decide. And so eventually they just don't know what to do, and there is no Khan. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's a possibility. And that sets up the prolonged interregnum that is around Temujin, Chinggis Khan's birth. Now, another pre-1229 Kurultai is the 1206 Kurultai. And this also has unusual timing. The best we can say about, and there's two references to it. I would say it seems to be accurate that this was probably a Tsagaan-Sar time Kurultai. That is to say, Tao Zongyi says it took place in the 12th moon, and Rashid-ad-Din says it took place at the beginning of spring, according to the lunar calendar. Therefore, these two, it's roughly from the 12th moon of the cow year to the first moon of the tiger year. So, and all other ones in my database, all of the Kurultais in my database after this 1206 one are from the 3rd moon to the 9th moon, lunar. But it's also interesting here to note that the idea that Chinggis Khan had this big 1206 Kurultai, and that was when the empire founded, everybody knows that, is a later historiographical kind of intervention. The Secret History of the Mongols emphasizes this, but as those who study the Ilkhanate know, many earlier sources actually held that Chinggis Khan became Khan in 1203 when he replaced Ong Khan. So Ong Khan was died, and in the autumn there was a great assembly at the. So here, these are two references from my translation of the authentic chronicle, which is cited in the Shengwu Qinzheng Lu and also in Jamiat Tawarikh. In this, at first in autumn 1203, it says we're going to have a big assembly, and then they're going to go conquer the enemy Ong Khan of the Keryat in central Mongolia. Then, having destroyed, and then under the winter of that time, it says, His Majesty, Chinggis Khan, having destroyed Ong Khan, that winter he held a great hunt at Temugay steppe, and then he proclaims laws and things like that. And that's another Kurultai. And once again, it's a winter Kurultai, one in that winter period. So just to give you a sense of some of the variation that occurs. All right, so if we get back to a final last background issue before we get to Chinggis Khan's actual passing away, is the whole question, the famously involved question of the succession struggle. So the succession, and of course we have so many ideas. I almost want to ask someone in the people in the audience, give me a theory of Chinggis Khan's succession. Who did he want to have succeed him? And I'm sure most of you could do that. And I won't embarrass you by doing that, but I'm sure most of you could. Among the famous theories are that Chinggis Khan, Tolui should have succeeded him because he was the youngest son, and Mongols have a tradition of ultimogeniture. Another one is Ogedei was chosen because he had the best personality, and so on. A third one, the famous debate in the Secret History of the Mongols, is that Chinggis Khan, before his Great Western Expedition, says, "Who's going to succeed me?" So first of all, Chinggis Khan looks at Jochi, his eldest son, and says, "Who's going to succeed me?" And Tagade says, "Are you looking at him because you think he's going to succeed you? That Merkit bastard," literally meaning illegitimate child of the Merkit, not bastard. Well, also probably bastard in the other sense. The two did not get along. And so Jochi and Tagade kind of fight it out, and then in the end, Chinggis Khan sort of treats them as basically, these two guys have kind of disqualified themselves. Okay, we'll go with the next one, who's Ogedei. And Tolui is kind of asked, well, what will you do? And Tolui says, I'll support Ogedei. So, and then that's that. There's an interesting summary of this in a Tibetan source that says it's coming from the Yikatovchan, the great history, as opposed to the secret history. And we don't quite know what this is. I believe it's a Kublai era history. And this kind of summarizes it in an interesting way. It's clearly the same version of it, that while the ruler was alive, the two elder sons, that is Jochi and Tagade, had presented letters, and that's a muchulge, you see the description there, by which they would not struggle. They promised in writing not to struggle for the throne, and they were given to administer lands. Their younger brother, Ogedei, sat on the throne for 6 years. But Tolui, the youngest son, did not present a letter at that time. So that's a kind of interesting. It's essentially a summary of what the secret history of the Mongols says. But because Tolui did not submit a letter, he was legally free to contend for the throne with Ogedei's descendants. The questions, which I don't have answers to, are: was this decision ever made public? Were such muchulge ever known? In other words, for example, did the Secret History of the Mongols author have in front of him or herself an actual muchulge like that? And I believe there are a number of decrees that are embedded in the Secret History of the Mongols. So that's not an entirely outlandish possibility, but I don't know. All right. So then Genghis Khan died, and we have, again, different traditions about what he said, what his last testaments were. And this is kind of relevant to the interregnum. One tradition is that he had he knew he was going to die. He had brought his commanders in and told his commanders, the key thing is don't tell the Tanguts that I'm dying, and when they surrender, they're about to surrender, we're just negotiating it, don't tell them I'm dying. When they surrender, let them come out and surrender, then kill them all. Another one says it's about succession, and it should be Tagade with the I for not there. So one of the parts of this tradition is Tagade was not actually participating in the Tangut expedition. So Ogedei and Tolui were in their own kurens about 2 or 3 days away when Genghis Khan died. Remember, he did die when he was on an expedition against the Tanguts in what is now Liupanshan, an area of southern Ningxia Hui Autonomous Prefecture. So and then there's a statement here in which he says basically he kind of secretly did nominated Ogedei as his successor, and then told him, go home, stay home, follow the Yasa, don't let Tagade screw everything up. And then, now you must go. So that's the other tradition. There's another interesting tradition that is embedded in the Yuan Shi. It probably comes from the Kublai Khan era, 1288 era, authentic chronicle of Tolui, that Genghis Khan did have like this one, it's a secret thing with one of the princes, but only with Tolui. And he tells Tolui, I've got a secret plan to conquer the Jurchens. And it sort of involves going through Sung territory, predicts wrongly that the Sung dynasty is going to be okay with that. And then in summer 1231, Tolui pulls this secret plan out of his pocket to Ogedei at a Kurultai at 99 Springs at Inner Mongolia. So again, there's all kinds of stories about what was Genghis Khan's last testament, and your guess is as good as mine. Anyway, all right. So what actually happened during the interregnum? So roughly speaking, it's a kind of, these are the stages, and I'm just going to sort of summarize them so that to keep the narrative clear. First of all, there was a secret funeral and mourning. And one of the key things is, at this period, it looks like nobody was officially communicated that Genghis Khan had died. So the Jin dynasty, the surviving powers around were not told that the guy has died, the great conqueror. Then there are, in the winter, 1227, 28, roughly from probably around December through to maybe early February, there were 3 campaigns, and I'll show you maps of those campaigns, and you can take a look at them. But then, for some reason that's really obscure, but all of them were sort of like, these campaigns were wrong, they shouldn't have happened, this was totally a bad thing. And that happened around February 1228. Genghis Khan dies in August. Then Ogedei and Tolui, then we have this kind of period where it looks like this is when sort of Tolui maybe becomes a regent of some sort, some kind of caretaker of the empire. And then finally, we'll talk about Ogedei and Tagade, and the question of prostration. They then decide to have a Kurultai, probably around fall 1228 is when they make a decision to actually go ahead and nominate or have a Kurultai to create a successor to Genghis Khan. All right, so let's take first of all, so the secret funeral and mourning, here we have this is a famous thing, you've probably heard about this, when the Mongols, when somebody when a Khan dies, they kill everybody and keep it super secret and everything like that. And it's interesting, the 2 examples of this that are given in the sources are, one, Rashid ad-Din does this with Genghis Khan, and then Marco Polo says it's about Mongke Khan in 1251. And the interesting thing about, I think, an important commonality in both these cases, in both cases the emperor died while on campaign. Mongol forces were actually in highly exposed positions out sort of in the front of the enemy, and there was probably, the reason why it was so super secret was that they needed to extract their armies before the enemy knows that the Mongol Khan in command of the armies has died. So there's probably an aspect of that. Again, as we all know, the burial places of the Mongol Khans were certainly kept quite secret. All right. So now we have these three campaigns, and these are interesting because this is something I sort of pieced together from a series of very separate references. The first one is against Dunka, or Tunka. And this is actually a reference in Rashid ad-Din. It is corrupt in all of the existing texts of Rashid ad-Din, but it's quite clear from, if you know what you're looking for, it's quite clear. There's Dongxia, which is the Chinese for there was a regime of a Khitan guy, Wanu. And Wanu, Puxian Wanu, who was of Jurchen origin, not Khitan, he founded a regime. It was one of these kind of backwash regimes created by people who were sort of refugees or taking advantage of the Mongol conquest, and there was all the kind of chaos. There were similar ones in the Middle East, like the Karakhitai regime and so on. He had one over there, and there was an expedition against him, which is interesting enough, was said to have been commanded by Alchidai, who was Chinggis Khan's nephew, and also by Guyuk, later grandson of Okudai, and later to be Great Khan from 1246 onwards. So it's a fairly big deal. There's another campaign that took place, again, you see farther down in the southwest, and that began Mongol troops originally stationed in the Transoxiana or Mauernacher region, crossed the river, first went to Nishapur, which again was it was a kind of no man's land. The whole Khorasan area was kind of no man's land. But then from there struck against Khwarezmian remnants like Ghiyasuddin Pir Shah, who was a son of one of the sons of Muhammad Shah, the Khwarezm Shah, in the area of Rai, Kashan, and Isfahan. So I've shown you where those cities roughly are. And then finally, in the Jin Dynasty chronicles, we have a reference to Shangzhou, which is an area just kind of right. The Jin Dynasty was focused really in this Kaifeng area, in the Henan area, and there was mountains that separated it from the Xi'an area, the Wei River Valley. And Shangzhou is kind of right at the entrance to those mountains. So if you're going to them, you're definitely trying to break into Henan and eventually end the Jin Dynasty. So what all of these things have in common is their attempts to, in some sense, clean up unfinished business left by Chinggis Khan. We have Khwarezmians down in the southwest, we have this Jurchen splinter regime in the northeast, and when we have the Jin Dynasty itself in Henan. But in the end, these campaigns, in some weird sort of way, and again, we have these very strange references. Ibn al-Asir talks about how this campaign sent to the southwest, eventually the son of Chinggis Khan. Now, wouldn't we like to know which son? Unfortunately, Ibn al-Asir does not tell us. He doesn't, interesting enough, he's very good on campaigns, but he doesn't seem to know the Chinggis family very well. He says, this was a rogue raid. These are not our followers. We banished them from our presence. Another thing, and this campaign against Tunka, where you see with Alchidai Noyan and Guyuk Khan going on about it, it says that before Ogedei was enthroned, quote, everybody was disputing about this. There's something wrong with this campaign, but nobody knows what it is. Maybe people knew what it was, but Rashid ad-Din doesn't tell us what it is. So I don't know what it is. So something's wrong with these campaigns. These campaigns, in some sense, are repudiated. And this takes place around February. And we know that in February, from around February 12th, Chinggis Khan's death was public, because on February 12th, the prefect of Kaifeng, Wangyang Maginchu, was sent to the Great Yuan to deliver condolences. Now, the Jurchen had tried to keep up some kind of peace negotiations with the Mongols throughout 1227. The previous one was in the spring. Then they have this big gap. And then, so finally in February, they send condolences. My estimation, this is when they actually learned, at least officially, that Chinggis Khan really was dead, and they're announcing that he's dead. So that's the big change, and that takes place in 1228. By the way, this message is rejected, but it looks like it's not rejected until August of 1228. So he's probably at the Mongol court or somewhere there until August when he's sent back. So one of the questions here is this question of Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan's four main sons, of whom three were alive when he died. Tolui served as a crown prince for a time, is what we read in one statement. Other ones would talk about how Tolui sat firmly on the throne. And the idea that he was some sort of official regent is probably a Kublai-era historiographical conclusion. But I don't think it's entirely groundless. So I think there's something about it. Because what we do have is we have some evidence about where people were, literally, physically. Where were the princes, the three princes, sons of Genghis Khan who were alive? Tagade, Ogedei, and Tolui, in order. So one quote we have here about Ogedei is in Habok, but Tolui handles some affairs in North China. And note, supervision of North China is associated with controlling the imperial center. It later says that in the summer, Ogedei avoided the heat at Oskhan, where I'll show you where that is. And then, remember, Tagade had been ordered to remain behind, and he formed a wing. It looks like Tagade was sent back to sort of Transoxiana, sort of the Central Asia area. So here's where the geography plays out. You can see the red there is the center, and then I've also circled Zhengdu, which is the capital of the administrative capital of North China at the time. Then in the kind of aquamarine, you show the two places, Habok and Oskhan, which is Uzgen in modern Kyrgyzstan. And then to the left of that, you see where Tagade, supposedly his winter pastures were in Al-Malik, and his summer pastures were near Samarkand and Bukhara. That's sort of standard thing. And then we also have Batu and so on. They were not so important. So in other words, it looks like whether Tolui was an official regent or not, he seems to have been the one who was in the center handling the affairs of North China, which kind of places him in the center. So we have this question, though, who was this son of Genghis Khan who sent the letter saying, these guys are not our followers, we banish them? Now, the person who was in the area of Transoxiana was probably Tagade. So I'm guessing, it's a guess, that it was probably Tagade. And what's interesting is that in the summer of 1228, Ogedei and Tolui get together. They have a council to send Chormagan, or he's called Chorman in the source here, but it's actually also known in the Persian sources as Chormagun. These are Chormagan and Chormagan. Chormagun and Chormagan are like Johnny Boy and John Boy, two different ways of hyperchoristic reference to Chorman. But it's interesting, the commanders who are supposedly banished from the presence, they show up in 1230 as actually subordinate commanders under Chormagan. So in other words, they weren't really banished. They were just, the campaign itself was canceled, but these people weren't canceled. So finally in autumn 1228, we have an interesting reference. Again, these are coming from the Shengwu Qinzheng Lu, which I've translated and which I hope that will be coming out fairly soon. Ogedei came from Habok for an audience at the Genghis Khan's great palace. This is an audience, it's a little like what happens with the Incas. The great Inca goes to have an audience with his deceased father. And, so you go to the Orda, you have an audience with Genghis Khan. It probably involves the announcement of some kind of grand affair, this announcement of things that happen through there. And so from then on, it looks like Ogedei is actually in the center. So there, roughly in the red, those stars there mark what I believe to be the likely position, and then there's it's in the run up to the Kurultai. Tolui meets him at this place, Gorbin Sobchit, which is north of Ulaanbaatar, and again in the red there. So again, it looks like from around the autumn 1228, Ogedei is in the center, and Tolui is probably off in his own appanage, which is on the slopes of the Altai. And in the coronation, there's a lot of text here, sorry, but roughly summarized, a couple of things happen. The first thing is we have that Tolui at one point wants to delay the Kurultai. He says, how about we just delay it a few days? And Ila Chutsai, who is this, they're all related to Ila Chutsai, which is a little bit unfortunate because his role is definitely being exaggerated. But he's the one who says, no, even a single delay would be inauspicious. It's got to be now. And then we have this interesting thing, Tagade. Ila Chutsai makes a specific efforts to make sure that Tagade does do a proper prostration to Chinggis Khan, to Ögedei. He says, you got to do it. If you do it, everybody else will follow your lead, and then it won't be a problem. So, and so that indicates that Tagade is seen as the most likely holdout, the person who might be a problem. And then they all prostrate themselves, and it becomes the clan elders' practice of the ceremony of prostration actually began from this time. I'm not sure that that's really true. So here we summarize knowable fact, what I regard as knowable facts and plausible inferences about this interregnum. Chinggis Khan dies, it's kept secret. His burial and mourning is completed. By February, there's campaign, some kind of Kurultai without the name, or some kind of unofficial bad Kurultai approves some campaigns, and then the campaigns are canceled. His death is publicly announced. In 1228, they begin campaign planning for the future. In autumn 1228, maybe they begin Kurultai planning, and then Tolui and Tagade seem to have some kind of issues, and then the Kurultai happens. So what are the conclusions? The first conclusion is that we see here princely politics. This is what people usually, this is what keeps these interregna so long. They just can't, it's like, the American presidential election season. They just can't decide who's going to be president. They can't decide who's going to be Khan, and they're electioneering for it. And interesting enough, the conflict here that we see seems to be Tagade versus Ögedei and Tolui, which is, I think, is relatively, it's plausible and has verisimilitude, because these are not the later, in the 1240s, it's Ögedei and Tagade's sides are like this. So this could be, I think it's fairly important. But I don't think the politics can't really explain. I mean, the politics continue, there were always politics. And later on in the Ilkhanate and the Yuan, the politics didn't make people have 2-3 year interregna. Something else. One interesting thing is that I think this command to shelter in place, it's a modern term, but it actually seems right. But the roads were, this is from a statement about Ögedei, Rashid ad-Din's statement about when Guya Khan died. The roads were closed, and the ordinance was issued for everyone to stop where he was, be the spot inhabited or in ruins. So everybody kind of like shelter in place. So what's this all about? Well, one thing that's very important, this idea, the taboo, or the sort of the sensitiveness of death is really visible in the sources. And one of the things is that the degree to which Chinggis Khan's death is hardly even, the Shengwu Qinzhenglu, this sort of major source, doesn't literally even mention his death. It just ends, and who knows why. It's all highly sensitive. We also have this fact that none of those who are present at someone's death, any ordinary person's death, can enter the order of a chief or an emperor until the new moon. Well, what if you're present at the death of, like, a Khan? Maybe that is super inauspicious. Maybe you have to wait for a year, something like that. Again, this cancellation of all government business reminds me of sort of like the Batumj, this sort of day to close, the day before Tagansar, everything, all the government seals are closed off, and no business may be conducted. Something like that. So there's something there. We can talk we can throw another ritual thing. But at the same time, one interesting question though is this idea of shelter in place, was this already a tradition in Chinggis Khan when Chinggis Khan died, or did it become a tradition in response to the initial confusion? Remember, the initial idea was, we don't tell anybody Chinggis Khan dies, we clean up his remain business, and then maybe we'll say something like that. We'll just go ahead and do it. And that somehow turns out to be unpractical for reasons which, those campaigns weren't particularly successful, but we don't know why. And so, but maybe it's in response to that they have this shelter in place order. And I'd like to finally, though, ask, maybe these interregna are so long because in the unified empire, it's not just a question of who will succeed the Khan, it is, are we going to have a successor to the Khan? Or maybe we'll just live without them. Maybe after Chinggis Khan dies, maybe after Chinggis Khan, I would argue that in 1222 or 1221, he decided that Zochi, his eldest son, was not suitable as a successor. Maybe he then decided, I don't need a successor. We have these 4 sons, we'll let them each, or, go on their way. Remember that Rashid ad-Din's account version of his, one source says that of the last will and testament, he tells Ogedei and Tolu, you go to your realms and peoples, for your realms are being neglected. Decentralize. Everybody go to your home and take care of your Olus kingdom. And the reality is that for 45 years, from 1206 to 1251, more than a fifth of them had no Khan. So the second longest ruling Khan in the unified empire is, first as longest is Chinggis Khan, the second is no Khan at all. And then the third one is Ogedei. So maybe there was to be no formal successor to the central Khan. The Mongol Empire would continue as a coalition of Olus kingdoms. There would still be some kind of center. Remember the Ordos shrines, they were political institutions, they were religious institutions, run by the widows of Chinggis Khan and also cared for by the Otchigin, the youngest son, that would be Tolui. They could continue kind of the center, but they would not be Khan. They would just be, Tolui would be he would be a small Khan, not a big, like on the same level as Ogedei, Dzogchen, Sagade. Now, someone might say, but all the sources we know have this big ideology of the unity of the empire and so on, the secret history of the Mongols, Juvenese, history of the world conqueror, but they all date from after 1251. So maybe it's the unity of, ideology of unity is actually a post-1251 construct, and there's other things I can unpack in that. And that's kind of interesting because it's interesting, after Mongke Khan dies is the first interregnum which does not last more than a year, in which they don't go through an entire year without a Khan. And that's in the 1259 to 1260 interregnum. Both Kublai and Arakboka get themselves proclaimed as Khan less than a year after their brother Mongke had died. And it's that rushed interregnum, maybe caused by an ideology of unity at all costs, must have a leader. That led to the breakup of the unified empire and the end of the great leader. Thank you.
Assistant Professor of History at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, so I am especially appreciative to come to California in February. It was negative 32 there this morning, so it's nice to be here. It is great to follow on where you just came from. I've already got some ideas about changing my own, but I'm going to basically pick up at this point where Professor Atwood left off. What I'm presenting today can probably best be described as a study of Mongol ruling structures in the years between the election of Ogedei Khan in 1229 and then that election of his son Guyuk in 1246. We'll also talk about 1251 along the way. Braudel would not like this. There's no long-term history here, but I think that there are some unresolved problems in understanding this period of particularly Ogedei's reign. I like where we left off with this question, maybe there was to be no central Khan at all. This is a good question. My project is an attempt to move us closer to an understanding of this period. None of this was much more than an idea before I heard from Franck and Kaveh, so we'll see if it's anything other than an idea. But here's what you can expect, anyway, in the next few minutes. I will briefly explain the context and origins of this research and my motivations for it. Next, I'll present this main contribution of the research, and that is to propose a model of ruling framework that has helped me to make sense of the role of the Khan during Ogedei's reign. Then we'll explore some of the interesting implications, relying a lot on the work of Florence Hodis and Michael Hope, on the Kurultai, how it limits this model of ruling framework that I'll present and what it tells us about the dynamics among the ruling elite in the time of Ogedei's reign. After that, I want to say a few words about how this relates, this ruling model relates to the Kurultai and our understanding of empire. And then finally, I'll just have a few words about the future of this research and how it ties back to the greater project. So this part of the research, what I'm presenting today, stems from a biographical project of Ogedei. Right? He's the third son of Genghis Khan's principal wife, Borte, born probably in 1185, selected by this Congress of Mongol elite. the Kurultai, as the Khan after the death of his father. And he died in office in the usual way. Professor Atwood, I like this. We call this a natural cause. And for Mongols, drinking yourself to death is probably a natural cause, right? So Ogedei's reign was important, in my view, for the efforts of the ruling elite and Ogedei himself toward the development of institutions of rule over subjects. I have previously looked at this waning of collective sovereignty in the reign of Ogedei as a result of this attention to state institutions. This current project, however, reconsiders some of those arguments, and instead I'm trying to understand the intention behind the administrative structures of the Mongol Empire during the reign of Ogedei. What I've discovered in this process is that by focusing on this period on Ogedei, it might contribute to solving some of these persistent problems in the early Mongol Empire, and what I'm presenting today is one facet of that. I found it difficult along the way to fully understand the role that Ogedei was assigned to carry out, and I use assigned specifically, by the Kurultai that elected him by 1229. He was given this title of Khan and not Khan. Right? There's been some scholarship over the meaning and purpose of this title. Right? In the end, it seems to be a matter of pretty careful speculation. I don't exactly have a horse in this race about what Khan actually means, but I think it's important to keep in mind that there may have been some kind of intention behind the choice of this title. Second, Ogedei seems to have carried out a very deliberate institutionalization of the ruling frameworks. Those ruling frameworks in place to govern subject peoples. So pronounced are these efforts that I would consider it a kind of feature of Ogedei's reign. It seems he was carrying out a plan, and I look to this Kurultai in 1228-29 for possibly a design of that plan, because I believe it is possible that this institutionalization process was, again, an assignment to Ogedei, or maybe to the office of Khan, more accurately, by the decision makers. And finally, it's also important for me to understand the extent of Ogedei's authority, that is, the office of Khan. Was he Khan or emperor? Right? Was he first among equals, the convener of the Kurultai, or was he sovereign over an empire? Was the Khan a participant in the collective sovereignty through which the elite ruled, or was he a monarch, an autocrat over subject peoples? Sources basically can say all of these things. And much of this is acknowledged in our existing scholarship, but I find it wanting when examining Ogedei's role specifically. The mechanisms of all of this, the confederation, the Mongol elite, the role of the Khan, the state, how all of these functioned are necessary for me to work out in producing this biography of Ogedei. So here's how I'm trying to move towards this understanding. First, this is the pastoral nomadic confederation during this period, right after 1229. Legitimation is functionally granted through the mechanism of the Kurultai. My model focuses on a specific explanation that stakeholders have of the Khan, or an expectation that the stakeholders have of the Khan, and that is the distribution of wealth. Michael Hope says that while, this is his quote, the Khan's power was in effect held at the discretion of stakeholders, he was also expected to protect the powers and incomes which the stakeholders had obtained during the lifetime of Genghis Khan. I think the key to this figure for me is the function of the Kurultai in the relationship between stakeholders and the Khan. This is collective sovereignty at work. That is a cooperative venture in which a group of power holders chooses one Khan to meet certain expectations, the most important of which is continued enrichment of those stakeholders. I expect nothing here stands out as problematic, although bring it up to me later. The second part of this framework is that applied by the Mongols onto subject peoples. You'll see in this model that the Khan is not first among equals here. He's a supreme authority, right? He's an emperor. Via the mechanisms of these state institutions, he rules over his subjects. By those same state institutions, wealth in the form of taxes, products, labor, is collected and returned to the Khan. It's the state that seems to me to be the particular and specific realm of duty that Ogedei was meant to carry out. that the role of the Khan was meant to carry out. It is in this area that he seems to have put this real effort into creating something new. You can probably guess where this is going. This final diagram shows how I understand the office of Khan was meant to function in the reign of Ogedei. Confederation and state are separate ruling frameworks. State was meant for subject peoples, more specifically for the maintenance of ongoing sources of wealth. It was a responsibility of the Khan to create, to integrate, and then manage that system. Seems to me that after he's tasked with this responsibility by stakeholders, he begins to engage in this development of state institutions. He's responsible for distributing that collected wealth from subjects to stakeholders according to their rightful shares. Hope, again, says that in the many instances of Ogedei sharing the collected wealth was not an indiscriminate show of beneficence, but rather recognition of the collegial nature of Mongol rule. These were not simple gifts, but rather the portion and the share of the collective wealth due to Genghis Khan's family and followers, right, which they had accumulated through service to the empire. I'm not hesitant to say that I believe that this collection and redistribution of wealth to be one of, if not the, reason for the entire Mongol enterprise. Up to this point, right, up to at least Ogedei's reign. As such, this Kurultai, 1229, chose to make the Khan an office with a specific duty. The purpose of the state was to enrich stakeholders. This was how they attempted to make that happen. Part of what I think this contributes, or makes it easier for me to accept anyway, is the existence of sometimes two opposing strategies of rule. There's been a lot said about this, but I don't think I've seen exactly this before, partially because it's a very limited application. This really can only represent the stakeholders in Ogedei during a limited period of time. I had a note here to explain, to defend my use of stakeholders, but since Professor Atwood put it up here first, if it ruffles your senses, remember he said it first. But I'll explain why I use this. This whole model is suggested by corporate business structure. Right? I found it useful to think about the Mongol Empire as a business. And for someone like me who sees wealth as the primary motivating factor, it isn't really that difficult. Stakeholders originates from this line of thinking. And it's a better term than elite because it more accurately reflects the material interests in the successes of the Confederation and the rights to their collective profit their activities produce. In fact, if we substitute some of these terms with others, say subjects, employees for subjects, instead of institutions, management structure, the CEO as Khan, stakeholders as a board of directors, not a lot about the functions of this model change. In fact, even if we complicated it a bit, my metaphor here would still hold up. It's the case that many corporate boards appoint members or minders or representatives within the business management structure as ways to monitor that their interests are being served. Such was also the case with Ogedei, in which he had to accommodate the placement of stakeholder representatives within these state institutions. Representatives were there essentially to make sure that the interests of the stakeholders were being served. Right? But there's a little more to this. In the early 2000s, I worked for the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. One of the particular kinds of things we offered were workshops designed to help businesses meet challenges. One of the most popular of these workshops was one designed to help family businesses going through the transition from founder to heirs. That is, a transition from businesses built upon the founder's personality, their connections, their charisma, their interests, their dreams, to a business with office holders carrying out specific duties, codified procedures with quantified goals. Many family businesses fail at this transition. At this juncture, many family businesses fail. I see the same transition happening here, that the transition from Genghis Khan, the founder of the family business, there has to be a decision made. What is the future of this enterprise? And I see that this Kurultai in 1229 and the results of what happened after that to represent this. I'm not sure whether they succeeded or not. Later, I found myself actually married into a family whose family business was going through the same process. And I was able to closely monitor, to observe what was going on, this transition from my father-in-law, the dreamer, the artist, the artisan baker, to my brother-in-law, who was trained in the Stern School of Business, working in investment banking, had to basically face this transition. How do you institutionalize a family business without losing what makes that business successful? Yet there are some limitations to this model. For example, it doesn't account for the military, a topic that we can't really ignore about military campaigns. Frankly, I don't have an explanation for that at the moment. But more importantly, the model as I present it here is normative. It's an idealized representation of what I believe to be the intentions behind this creation of the Office of Khan. I think key to Ogedei's reign are these two ruling frameworks, and importantly, the role of the Kurultai. Trying to discern what the stakeholders at this 1229 Kurultai intended, or whether or not they deliberately created Ogedei's office to do what my model is suggesting here, is bound to be unsuccessful. I can't get into their heads, but even if they didn't intend this model still tells us something about how the Kurultai and the empire were related. Hope says that the Kurultai in 1229 defined the relationship between central government, and this here to mean the state, and the elites, the stakeholders of Genghis Khan's former regime, because the procedures adopted by the Kurultai of 1229 came to represent the permanent division of power in the Mongol Empire. Right? And that's, I think, this division that we're looking at. I'd add to this that power included what I'm calling the state here. Right? For me, the evidence of this is in the actions and the policies of Ogedei during his reign. So here's my understanding of the Kurultai, which is supported by, again, the work of Florence Hodis and Michael Hope. The legitimacy of the Kurultai, of the Khan, is granted through the Kurultai. The source of the Kurultai's legitimacy, according to Hodis, is legal in nature. Here are the principal markers of that legitimacy in the Kurultai. Right? The principal function of the Kurultai seems to have been informally granting legitimacy to a new person or new decisions, according to Hodis. The full attendance by political elite was considered compulsory. The feature of the Kurultai was this requirement for all concerned parties, that is, all of the stakeholders, to be present, for decisions to be taken in a collegial manner. It was full attendance at a Kurultai which guaranteed the legitimacy of its decisions. And finally, those decisions are considered binding on all who take part. So, binding decisions made by the full attendance of stakeholders is what gives the Kurultai legitimacy. Collective sovereignty expresses its authority primarily through this Kurultai, and it's the act of Kurultai that was the only place that collective sovereignty actually operated or existed. The source of legitimacy and decisions was the Kurultai. The Kurultai was the voice and body of collective sovereignty. David Morgan's question, who ruled the Mongol Empire? My answer here is the Kurultai, at least in this period. There were two Kurultais in Ogedei's reign. There were more, but there are two important Kurultais in Ogedei's reign. The one that elected him in 1229 and the one that he called after the conquest of the Jin in 1234. That is what I have marked here as 1235. Neither of these were like those Kurultais under Genghis Khan. Ogedei did not possess this charismatic authority of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's Kurultais seem to have been mostly a matter of confirming his decisions. According to Hope, again, the Kurultais after the death of Genghis Khan seem to have regained some of their former character as consultative forums. That is, the Kurultais once again operated as a place for decisions to be made collectively. Nor, more importantly for my work here, are they comparable to those after Ogedei's death in 1241. For these Kurultais are marked by conflict and a lack of collegiality, maybe even a lack of unity. In 1229, as well as in 1235, there are no conflicts that undermine the legitimacy of their decisions. I know that 1235, no Khan was selected here, but 1235 stands out as not a routine Kurultai. The Jin had just been conquered. The Kipchak campaign was being planned. This is a Kurultai that stands out as being different than the others. That's why it's included here. Therefore, this model I have for Ogedei's reign is only functional as long as all stakeholders are participating in a single Kurultai that follows the parameters that I've already stated. Hope adds that the act of confirming the yasak of Genghis Khan is another way that we can measure the smooth transition of power. For example, because there was no challenge to Ogedei's accession after he's elected, Ogedei can easily confirm the validity of his father's decrees and policies, Genghis Khan's yasak. Compare this with the election of Monkey in 1251, after which Monkey could not confirm the yasak of his predecessor, since his own legitimacy rested partly in the argument that Guyuk had been either illegally or illegitimately selected as the Khan. So the next aspect of this line of argument is what it means for our understanding of empire, right, the Mongol Empire. And here I mean a single polity with a single ruling structure. So I want to propose this. We should consider a single Mongol Empire to have been concluded, to have been over by 1251, and possibly by 1246. I'll explain that in a moment. By using these measures of what constitutes a legitimate Kurultai, along with the premise that Kurultai is the expression of authority of collective sovereignty, and that it was the stakeholders through collective sovereignty that ruled the Mongol Empire, it seems that we cannot find these characteristics in the Kurultai of 1251 and maybe not even in 1246. So a single empire then cannot be said to exist where there are competing Kurultais or Kurultais that cannot make decisions because of the lack of legitimate attendance. So here, 1235 is here because it is the last certainly legitimate Kurultai of a unified Mongol Empire. The end of the collective part of collective sovereignty also signals the end of a single empire and a single state. Multiple collective sovereignties exist after Ogedei, are formalized probably in the division of the Mongol Empire between Batu and Monkey. But certainly, by the time that both Arikh Bokhe and Kublai are raised to the position of Khan at competing Kurultais. So I'll explain why I'm undecided here about the election of Guyuk in 1246. While there were no competing Kurultais, there is another factor here, and that's Batu's absence. It brings into question the Kurultai's ability to make legitimate decisions. Yes, his representatives were present, but it seems that may not have been enough to meet the collective sovereignty's expectations from the senior Chinggisid. As Juvayni put it, whatever Batu says is law, because of his senior status. His absence in 1246 is a problem, and I'm fairly sure this probably has something to do with Guyuk's movement toward Batu in 1248, the campaign, or perhaps it was just a trip with his army towards the Golden Horde that he died on in 1248. Right. So, again, here are the three things that are important. First, this division of confederation and state, with the Khan key to understanding how the state served the confederation. Second, Kurultai as the way in which stakeholders exercised their authority, collective sovereignty in action. And the third is how we can use these first two as a test for empire. So many suggestions have been made about as to when the Mongol Empire ended, collapsed, fragmented, dissolved. But if the above two are true, then I feel compelled to say that 1251 is confirmation of the end of that singular empire. So I hope what I can make clear in this process is that by focusing on the reign of Ogedei and his immediate successors, the issues of this state and empire are illuminated somewhat, and that the office of Khan as it's intended or interpreted in 1229 and filled by Ogedei is more simply explained. What it contributes to the larger project of Ogedei's biography is a framework that more readily allows me to examine the purpose and meaning of his actions as Khan, right, as well as a kind of standard to measure the success or the failures of his policies and actions. One of the interesting things actually that this has led to is that if I can defend 1251 as a date for end of empire, if it matters, is that we now have two central characters in the story of the end of empire. and that's Batu and Turegine. Right? Their conflict really begins in this 1241. Their conflict over delaying this selection of Khan is probably not really resolved until 1251. So somewhere before that date, by using the measurements of this Kurultai, we've lost that unity in the empire. And one final corollary to all of this is that if the 1251 date can work, it also means that Ogedei is the first and the only Khan of the Mongol Empire. He creates the state institutions, and that perhaps I could argue that the empire was a creation of Ogedei and it died with him. Or more accurately, maybe at the end of Turegine's reign, as I believe she has to be considered a ruler in her own right. The de facto rule during the second part of Ogedei's reign and her so-called regency up until the election of Guyuk. But I think these are arguments for another place. So in the discussion, I would welcome some of your input. I can see the connections already to what's being presented here. And so I would welcome that. So thank you.
And I want to really thank Frank and Kaveh for organizing this wonderful workshop. It's a really important topic, and I've been learning so much from both the talks before me, and I see a lot of connections here, so hopefully this will be also productive. This material I'm going to talk about today is part of an unpublished chapter from a dissertation that has been languishing for a while. So this is a really good opportunity for me to go back to this material and kind of see what I can do with it and try to reframe and rethink it. But I'm trying to also do kind of a new framework and kind of introducing another element into this kind of already very full discussion, and that's religion in the empire. You know, in a way, I'm going to take us towards, I'm going to try to link three elements here in my talk today. One is Ilkhanid succession politics and rulership patterns. Two is Chinggisid system of sacred divinized kingship, and I'll explain what I mean by this sacred kingship. And three is ruler conversion to Islam in the Ilkhanate. And just kind of, okay, the Mongol Empire, of course, and a map of the four Khanates, of course. And we're talking about the Ulus Hulegu in Greater Iran, we might say. And I'm going to move around a little bit between the pre and post 1295 moment, which in 1295, Ghazan Khan converts to Islam, becomes a major moment because after that, the Mongols they remain Muslims, right, and becomes a Muslim state in many aspects. Okay. So one of my first arguments in this paper today is that the Ilkhanic succession patterns and claims and the Chinggisid model of sacred immanentist kingship, and I'll explain what I mean by that, were interlinked. And the second argument is that the conversion to Islam in the Ilkhanate also presented for Ghazan and his successor Ul-Jayto an opportunity to try and break away from their ongoing problems of legitimacy and succession politics. And I'll hopefully be able to show that in the paper. These problems stem from the principles of succession to high office that seem to have informed the Ilkhanid case. Where'd they go? Ilkhanid case, at least. This move to conversion to Islam did not amount to what we might call wiping the succession slate clean, as historian Alan Strafford would argue in the case of the conversion to Christianity of dynastic states across the Pacific, but rather the Ilkhanid adoption of Islam appears to have offered, I think, mechanisms and tools to address the challenges that the existence and perseverance of more senior Chinggisid family members in the Ilkhanate posed for the Ilkhan Ghazan's legitimacy during and after his rise to the throne, and more generally for what we might call the Abakide family branch within the Ilkhanate. So what I would like to suggest very briefly today is that there seems to have been some kind of system first. There's a system of seniority-based succession in the Ilkhanid kind of case, at least, based likely on some earlier Inner Asian patterns of succession that was in place in the Ilkhanate. But traditionally, we might say that we have three problems kind of that have prevented us from seeing this succession pattern emerge. First, I mean, this is well known, as Peter Jackson has shown, and others. You know, the Ilkhanid state was established by Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, and the Hulaguid house after him was not initially intended to form an independent Khanate or Ulus, and this had major influence on the patterns of succession as well. To put it more explicitly, Abbaqah Hulagu's son, who succeeded his father in the Ilkhanet, was likely not, in contrast to what kind of the sources tell us, Hulagu's most senior son. They actually say he was a senior son. We know he was not. And he was not the proper successor to his father. He was more likely sort of an initial placeholder, while his more senior brothers were still on their way to Iran from Mongolia after their father's death. So in what seems to be likely a very complex system of appendages, and linked to Monk's own vision of what he actually planned would happen following sending Hulagu to the Eastern Islamic world. Second, it seems that if there was indeed some logic of succession based on seniority of Hulagu's sons, or rather of that of his wives, and I'll explain that in a minute, it was disrupted, early on by the disputed rise of Abbaqah's sons, the Ilkhan Arun in 1284, and his brother Gechato after him, and Arun's sons Ghazan and Uljeto. Third, and our most important source in this regard is Rashid ad-Din, which has been mentioned already a couple of times here today, his volume on the history of the Mongols. But Rashid ad-Din is a problematic author as well, and we have to take this into account, and he kind of influenced the way we see the empire, of course. He really is interested in getting legitimacy for the specific family line within the Ilkhanid Hulaguid house, the Abbaqaites, and thus tries to sweep under the rug, and just sort of, skip this. He tries to sweep under the rug moments of inter-Chinggisid or inter-Hulaguid discontent, conflict, and resistance, describing these either as illegitimate rebellions by lesser Hulaguid contenders to the throne, or as conspiracies of conniving commanders and heretic religious figures, more on which soon. Christopher Atwood, in his really excellent translation to A Secret History, which I've been reading with my students, and we've been having a great time with it, I'm writing the introduction, and I really like kind of the way he puts this, that while unity, family, ethnic, political unity is the work's key theme, indeed fraternal unity is proclaimed repeatedly as a virtue in the work. Fraternal conflict, actually, up to including purges within the family, is the covered reality. And the perpetrators, primarily Genghis Khan himself, seem to suffer little consequence for what they do, right? Killing their siblings, etc. So Rashid ad-Din's narrative might be seen as offering a similar paradox to what the secret history historian has done, offers us. He takes steps, this is Rashid ad-Din, of course, takes steps to systematically blur the existing resistance among the Hulaguid princes to the rise of the Abbaqaid family, especially to Ghazan, and fictively presents this usurpation of the throne as based on a broad Hulaguid consensus, a unity over the Abbaqaid succession. And it's really kind of funny when you read the narrative, you keep on getting the sense that everyone's in agreement, but they keep on fighting. Everyone's in agreement, but they keep on resisting. So it's a very confusing kind of element going on. Contending members are presented often mostly as unsuitable, unfavorable, illegitimate, lazy, and unwilling to rule. They actually say, we don't want to rule, right, often. Sometimes heaven itself demonstrates that the contender is unfit. For example, the senior Prince Tarai, son of Hulagu, who was the father of Beido, and who would become Ghazan's main opponent, actually, to the throne, died by lightning on his way from Mongolia to Iran, which is, of course, a really bad, symbol. It's an indication that heaven is, does not support his candidate, of course, and he's sort of, damning for the whole family, the branch leading from Tarai to Beido. So if our main source, Rashid ad-Din, is significantly biased, can we decipher a system of succession in place? Well, thankfully, I would say we have mothers, and this is another reason to be grateful to mothers, right? And in this case, despite or perhaps due to Rashid ad-Din's sometimes painful apparent efforts to disrupt the order of Hulagu's wives, and this is an example from the Panchigane, Shaul Panchigane, especially by fictitiously presenting Dukus Khatun as Hulagu's chief wife, and she was not, we get a strong indication of how, because he worked so hard, I think, to kind of present this kind of weird family wife system and seniority of wives, we are able to kind of uncover what's going on, and we get a strong indication of how important the system of seniority of wives of the Khan was in the Ilkhanate. We can't go here into too much detail, of course, because of time, but why certain wives were designated, became chief wives and others not, and what was the system, the four kind of chief wives of the system within. However, we should note first that this descent from Chinggisid bloodline through matrilineal descent was especially significant. And this is a chart. It's very old, so my apologies for that. But if you look at Guyuk, Kutuy, and Ulje, they all have kind of Chingisid bloodline. All these three senior wives of Hulagu, basically. In fact, all three Hulagu's senior wives were Chingisids. And second, we find there that their status could decide the level of seniority of their sons. And indeed, when we kind of start to kind of sort of unpack the succession politics after Hulagu's death, it seems that the main candidate to the throne was actually his senior son, Jumhur, who is the son of the chief wife of Guyuk, of Guyuk. But he unfortunately dies on the way from Mongolia to Iran. Another following him was Ahmad Tigodor, who did succeed his brother Abaka, the placeholder, as I see it, while the third Monke Timur was likely a strong candidate but died too early to kind of get the throne. So all three of these sons, furthermore, interestingly, and I think that reaffirms this idea of that they were the senior sons, they married into their father's clans. And this is an important pattern because when we start looking at the Abakite branch and Arun and Abaka, we get a different, it gets super kind of confusing. We find that Abaka and his offspring did not fit these patterns at all. The clan of Abaka's mother, Yusunjin, is unidentified by Rashidin, doesn't tell us where she came from, which is like a weird thing for Rashidin, tells us everything, and more. She was likely a concubine of Hulagu. And the mother of Abaka's son, Rawun, as well, too, was an own good concubine, as not a chief wife as well. So, and so forth. So it gets, it continues this kind of mess of, success of the mothers, it continues on further on. Basically, the image that emerges is that Abaka was likely a temporary arrangement until the arrival of Hulagu's more senior wives and sons, specifically his most senior son, Jumhur, who died on the way, and Ahmad Tigodor as well, who succeeded, actually. And this more orderly system was disrupted when Abaka's son, Arun, usurped the throne from his uncle, Tigodor. Now, this is a good point to explain that I have told you that that I've told you all of this, not since our political history of the Ilkhanate needs to be revised, but to explain that the Abakite branch that would redefine the history of the Hulaguid Ulus lacked seniority and descent-based legitimacy. In contrast to more senior Hulaguid cousins roaming around Iran, and there were many of them, at least initially. So I think the Abakite branch were really struggling to make their claim, to stake their claim. And indeed, I think the proof for this is found in the pudding or the purges and the blood. So when we start looking, kind of uncovering pieces, from the chronicles, not just from Rashidin, from Vasaf, for example, we find that beginning in the later part of Arun's reign, 1288-ish, and continuing especially under his son Ghazan, the Abakites were implicated in several large-scale purges of the collateral lines and their supporters. In Rashidin's narrative, these are illicit rebellions. They're fitnas. They're against the legitimate government of the Abakites. Everyone's wrong. Just the Abakite family are right. Yet the order by which the non-Abakites, Hulaguid princes, rebel and die, beginning with Arun's execution of his most senior cousins, tells a different story, I think. Hulaguid princes are perished almost by order of their seniority within the family, raising another flag, I think, concerning Rashiduddin's version of the events. Rashiduddin is really quite aware, I think, of the legitimacy issue of the Abakite family. There's a very interesting episode in his narrative following the uprising against Ahmad Tigodor, where he sort of stages this debate over Hulaguid succession between the most senior commanders. Each kind of gives his own kind of agenda and kind of sort of brings his own kind of principle. During this kind of debate, they decide that Hulaguid biological seniority by descent and age is basically trampled and not as important as lineal succession from Abaka himself. Since Abaka, they claim, was appointed by the great Khan Monke himself to rule the Mamaliki Iran Zamin, the lands of Iran, with a wide unanimous agreement within the Chingisid house. So it's sort of like everyone agreed that Abaka should be the ruler, and now the succession should be linear from Abaka. The Vizier Rashiduddin is concerned here throughout this narrative, and not just here, with emphasizing the broad Chingisid or Hulaguid consensus agreement over Abakite succession, even when his narrative repeatedly notes resistance to the rise of the family's usurpation of the throne. And this, to my mind, suggests that the Abakite family, despite all these purges, needed to demonstrate that they did not break away from the Chinggisid system of ruling together, or the fiction of unity, as Atwood argues for the Secret History, despite massacring and killing all their cousins, basically. And perhaps one way to think about these genealogical tree, and there's a wonderful article by Evrim bin Bash, who's somewhere in the crowd, I think, on these kind of genealogical trees in the Ilkhani period as well, is sort of as a visual vision of unity, in a sense, right? Of a fiction of unity, in an interesting kind of way. One more note about this. I've suggested that the rise of Arun and the Abbaqides interrupted the system of succession in place that combined a category of descent-based seniority. But perhaps I got it entirely wrong, maybe. They did not interrupt anything, but actually what we see here is the principle of tanistry, as described by Fletcher, the election of the most qualified member of the family. So rather than seeing this as a bug in the system, destroying everything, was maybe the Abakai takeover is just a feature of what the Mongols were ultimately. But maybe we can return to this in Q&A. It's a thought process. I'm not completely sold in this yet. So moving to the second part of the presentation, on religion and Chinggisid sacred kingship. How do they fit into this kind of frame? As a way of introduction, I'll start by saying that I've recently suggested in my book that the Mongols subscribe to a mode of immanentist religiosity, and a model of divinized kingship. And so what am I talking about? So in a very, very, very broad sense, we can talk about religion as consisting of two contrasting tendencies, one towards the transcendentalism and towards immanentism. And these two terms can be assigned to specific characteristics within most religions, but we can also use them as sort of very broad frameworks for religions in their entirety. So what best defines transcendentalist religions? That's easy. These are Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam. The religion's orientation around individual salvation, right, and universal ethics, and formal doctrine, elements like that, right? In immanentist religiosity, on the other hand, which we call tribal, temple, or archaic, we can see that they're primarily concerned with harnessing supernatural or other forces in the here and the now, healing the sick, securing fertility and abundance, the well-being of the community, and its victory over the enemies. So to put it differently, while transcendentalist religions are committed to all important truth claims, which are competing with other truth claims, immanentist traditions are interested in the proven, empirically observable efficacy of rituals, gods, and clergy. So this is important, of course, that, I mean, these are ideal types and rather than historical realities, and all religions, societies, devotional movements, and ritual forms have exhibited combinations of the two. So why is this division even helpful? Why am I bringing it here? Why am I playing around with it at all? So one thing that really helps, I think, us understand is that by employing this theoretical framework, we are better suited to understand the changes that entailed by the Mongols' adoption of world religions, such as Islam and Buddhism. The transition from immanentist framework to a transcendentalist outlook. And I think it allows us to also understand the obstacles and challenges that the bearers of those religions experienced. And one of them is Rashid ad-Din himself, a Muslim convert to Islam, who is very much active in converting the Mongols to Islam. So what are the challenges they experienced in their efforts to gain believers in the Mongol elite? And what strategies did they develop? So in his book, Unearthly Powers, Alan further, another element of this, demonstrates that this conceptual division of immanentist versus transcendentalism is further aligned with two modes of sacralizing kingship, the divinized and the righteous. Immanentist societies deify kings through their affinity with gods by effacing their humanity. Conversely, in transcendentalist religions, kings are endorsed by a religious hierarchy or righteous guardians as righteous guardians of a system of salvation and truth. How do the Mongols fit into this? So very kind of, I think this would be very familiar, not kind of too challenging. The descendants of Genghis Khan subscribed obviously to the immanentist model of divinized kingship in this framework. They argued that Genghis Khan had an exceptional affinity with Tengiri, eternal heaven, and to maintain heaven's blessings to the Chinggisids, which was essential for the prosperity and upholding of Chinggisid universal domination, their imperial successors to the throne had to cultivate and sustain their relationship with Genghis Khan. In fact, potential successors of Khans in potentia, I think, often competed over demonstrating the intimacy or sturdiness of their link to Genghis Khan. But how do they do this? So a couple of things. First, they promoted this idea or fiction at times of blood and lineage, right? And that's why I think marrying into a Chingisid wife was so important for Chingisids themselves. This double blood was really important. You're closer to Genghis Khan through this blood thing. You're, as one historian has called it, maximizing the genealogical route of marriage by marriage, which it seems to be common across cultures, right? That was really important for the Mongols, for the Ilkhanids as well. Second, by imitation of divine-like traits attributed to Genghis Khan, especially his kind of superior empirical insight or unique intelligence, that he was sort of intuitive and delivered to him from heaven. And or the cultivation of a ritualized connection to Genghis Khan and the family's ancestral cult. And I think Johann Elverskog has done a wonderful work in kind of showing in his book, Our Great Qing, how the figure of Genghis Khan transitions from what we might call the heroic mode of divinized kingship to the cosmic mode. And he becomes sort of this ritual pivot for which, if by kind of the ritual connection, through the cult itself, that heaven's blessing to the family itself and the empire continues to flow on, right? So if you do the right rituals and you continue to venerate Genghis Khan, all these kind of blessings and heaven's support will continue to flow. Another, Another Chingisid principle that fits the mode of immanentist kingship is the concept of the special good fortune, which further confirmed heaven's choice of Genghis Khan and his offspring, and guaranteed his predestined success as the fortunate universal emperor. And this good fortune was a very immanentist, I think, auspiciousness. It wasn't determined not by abstract universal qualifying measures of moral conduct, as in religions like Islam and Buddhism, but empirically and palpably confirmed through the ruler's success on the battlefield, right? So if you're successful, you have that kind of su'ukut. And through the continuous, the conditions of the empire itself, right? All the riches coming through, as described before. In addition, this auspiciousness of good fortune was transferred and shared from Genghis Khan to the entire household, and especially his successors, and redistributed to the loyal commanders, the Kashig, which itself kind of brings out this idea of good fortune. All these, what I find intriguing and worth further pondering, however, is in this workshop perhaps, is that all these diverging tenets of the Chingisid sacred kingship seem to oscillate waves between two distinct modes of validating and reaffirming heaven's favor to the Chingisid successor. The ritualized genealogical is a sort of a communal, the ritualized genealogical or sort of communal, and the personal empirical. And this division kind of sort of works with two other divisions of divinized kingship, the cosmic and the heroic, actually, so it kind of fits very nicely, maybe too nicely, I don't know. The same can be said about the Mongol tradition. On the one hand, it expressed collectively the sacralization of the entire household, the Chingisid descendants through the cultivation of a link to Genghis Khan, while on the other, it also dispersed authority, right, and legitimacy among a large group of descendants and potential successors on a very individual level, leading to a certain proclivity towards performances of heroic mode and deeds of kingship. But these are very initial thoughts about kind of how this theory can frame within succession. In what remains, let me kind of finally reach to the issue of the conversion to Islam in the Ilkhanate and how I link this all together, or at all. So the Ilkhan Razan's adoption of Islam in 1295 has been studied by numerous scholars, of course. In short, kind of the most pivotal kind of research, I guess, is Charles Melville's demonstration that Razan's conversion in 1295 was likely motivated by his wish to gain the support of the pro-Muslim Mongol faction within the army, led by the Amir Nuruz. And Michael Hope has also studied this. There's great articles in this as well. Yet, I would like to suggest that the adoption of Islam might have also been presented as if offering certain advantages from the Abbaqides' perspective for restraining and controlling the field of potential successors based on the model of seniority-based legitimacy, which did not work in favor of the Abbaqide branch. In very simply saying, the Abbaqides had an ongoing problem of succession, of legitimacy within the family. They kept them being revolt or in agreement about having them having the throne. And one way, in addition to purging everyone else, one other way, and using historiography, right, as Rashidun does, the adoption of Islam kind of offered them different tools to claim, to narrow down the field of legitimacy to them. So, So in my book, I discuss how Buddhist Muslims and others sought to market their religious traditions as applicable and advantageous from the Mongol perspective, by demonstrating how their religious discourses enhanced and reinforced the claims of princely contenders or recently appointed khans to legitimate succession. And without going into too much detail, just really a quick example is pretty well known from Prince Jinjin's textbook of Tibetan Buddhism by Pakspa, and this wonderful example where he speaks about Genghis Khan as a Chakravartin king, this discourse of the universal ruler. But what he ends up doing after that is sort of charting this dynastic kind of succession route that goes from Genghis Khan to Uguday, of course, and Tului as well, and then to kind of leads up to Kublai, who's like the best because he adopts Buddhism. So he's, it reinforces kind of the decision, Kublai's rulership, right, as the right successor to the throne, leading from the Chakravartin king, Genghis Khan, and continues to Prince Jinjin as the potential successor in the future. So he marries really nicely Buddhism and kind of support of the Dharma with succession line, a specific succession kind of a theory, right, within of the empire and the Yuan dynasty. We find Muslims kind of accounts that present similar kind of, in a way, mirroring this, right? Genghis Khan is sort of a proto-monotheist, almost reaching Abraham's kind of level of understanding on his own that there's one God, even almost a prophetic kind of figure. In Rashiduddin's account, as Peter Jackson and Judith Pfeiffer show, the Vizier Rashiduddin fashions a succession line of monotheist-leaning rulers that leads from Genghis Khan and through the Hulaguid Abakide branch and reaches its kind of pinnacle with Razan. And they kind of interestingly, conveniently skip Ahmati Gudur in this narrative, even though he's actually the first Muslim, Ilkhan, right? So they're kind of tricking us really nicely. Furthermore, Rashiduddin and other Persian accounts are full of Perso-Islamic terminology that supports linear filial succession from father to son, and support this idea of the throne kind of transitioning from Abaka to his rightful successors, which are not Tigudor, of course, but according to this narrative, but Arun, right, and then Razan. For example, on his deathbed, in one narrative by Kashani, Razan is publicly pronounces his will, wasiya, and designation of his brother Nas, with the term Nas, which is a very Shi term, of his brother Uljaito as his heir apparent, the Wali al-Ahd, which evokes strong Shi comparisons, because Muhammad's designation of Ali as his sole legitimate successor in Ghadir Qum, according to Shi tradition. So it's kind of, they're using different kind of religious elements to support this claim of succession. Yet Rashiduddin takes this step, I think, further by arguing that the rebellious Hulaguid senior cousins of the Abakide line leaned towards heresy and were in fact tricked by heretics and deviant Sufi masters or other charlatans into laying their claim to the throne. Indeed, we find several princes who seem to have looked for support of Muslim charismatic authorities. One of the more detailed accounts appears is this really interesting, fascinating story about Ala Fireng, who's actually an Abakide, so it kind of doesn't fit, but he's an Abakide who seems to have had a claim and wasn't kind of what Uljaito, who was going to take the throne, wanted to happen. He's the son of Geikhato, who supposedly, according to different narratives, Rashiduddin, for example, ends up plotting with a deviant Mazdakite, fake Sufi figure, who kind of involves in this plot that includes Sama rituals to kind of entice him and kind of promises him the throne through this ritual engagement, puts his cap on his head and says you'll be king, and then Uljaito learns about it, Razan learns about this, and puts the entire group on trial and executes the plotter. Plot is he lets Ala Fireng live, but Ala Fireng is then executed by Uljaito just as he kind of gets the throne a few years later. These stories which serve, I think, Rashiduddin's narrative to present these ties between Sufi figures who use forms of divination and Sufi ritual and Chinggisid princes as part of an ongoing, almost 50-year-long conspiracy to dethrone the rightful Abakide kings can, however, also provide indication that Chinggisid claimants for the throne were happy to gain support of as many possible wielders of spiritual power and experts in interpreting heaven's will as they could, right? They're trying their best to gain that. Moreover, conversion to Islam might have been presented, I think, as a means of gaining some control over this field of holy characters. So very kind of basically what I'm suggesting that, we have all these religious characters moving around the Ilkhanate, offering the service to support specific candidates. And the Abakides, specifically Razan, is like, how do I get control over this religious field that is full of, potential charisma magnifying individuals, right? And when we see what the Abbaqids, what Ghazan does in Uljeto, they have no problem taking other antinomian kind of freaky sheikhs like Barak Baba, the tamer of wild animals, to kind of support them. But they also have no problem at the same time accusing other princes, the contending princes, of heresy and illicit rituals or magic as a means of denouncing unruly and disarming and terminating their rivals' supernatural support. Thus, I think royal conversion to Islam was also a way of limiting and containing this field immanentist economy of ritual efficacy that was exploited by contenders to the throne and threatened Abbasid domination. As Alan Strafford explains, one appealing advantage of ruler conversion to Islam or other monotheist religions is that it promised a kind of universal disarmament and an enduring freedom from the whims and exactions of other spirits. This might be linked to another strategy employed by Ghazan following his conversion, his generous establishment of religious endowments throughout the Ilkhanet, these waqfs, specifically establishments of a new kind of endowed institution, the House of the Saids, or Dar al-Siyada, the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, throughout major Ilkhanid centers. And Judith Pfeiffer has a wonderful article on this, and she's done a great job of this. What I'm kind of suggesting is that, what's happening here is that Ghazan is building institutions to kind of collect all these possibly powerful individuals into kind of powerful like charisma magnets, right, into one kind of center. In an account by Kashani, for example, Ghazan specifically compares this new Sayyid house to madrasas for scholars, Hanakas for Sufis, Zawiyat for dervishes. So he has this very kind of orderly kind of idea in mind, supposedly. So he's not beyond kind of being the defender of Ahl al-Bayt, the family of Muhammad. He might have tried to kind of collect all these spiritual authority of these individuals, people with affinity with some kind of powerful heaven, possessors of sacred, powerful genealogies and charisma into one kind of state-funded institutions where you can sort of maintain, organize, and control the access to them, right, from others. So it's not about, just being afraid that they'll do damage. It's more a thing about the fact that they were accessible to other claimants to the throne. So he's kind of pulling every possible kind of things into him. Finally, I would like to suggest that from the perspective of Ghazan's move to reinforce the Abbaqids, or rather his own legitimacy, in the face of this massive resistance to the Hulaguid cousins, another advantage of conversion to Islam was to gain control over the ritual field. So a really interesting example, and it's kind of long, but just really shortly, we have this kind of account in Rashid ad-Din where a really interesting account where the Mongol commanders and Khatuns approach Ghazan and they're after he destroys the shrine of his father. Abud Khaneh, likely a Buddhist temple that his father Arun had built and endowed to the Buddhists. And sorry, this is yeah, okay. And this is kind of a map of like Buddhist centers in the Ilkhanet, probably from Roxanne Presniak's article. We have some sites we think are associated with Buddhism. It's a whole kind of different topic, but this shrine likely also functioned as a site. It's not specifically this shrine. We don't know which shrine they're talking about in this narrative, but it's interesting. This shrine probably also worked as a ancestor veneration shrine. So in this account, they complained about his treatment of the site, not because they're like, oh, he's mistreating the Buddhists, but rather because of the state of the painted portrait or image of Arun on the temple's walls. So they're arguing basically that he's left the image of Arun kind of to the natural elements, it's being destroyed, and they propose to restore it by either reestablishing the shrine or building a palace instead in the location to appease Arun's spirit and redeem his name, right? So they're afraid that, maybe a retaliation from Arun's sick soul, right? His spirit kind of will attack them. Arun's portrait was considered a consecrated, inhabited, and animated image, and thus a meaningful channel for appeasing the spirits of the royal ancestors. The Amirs and Khatuns appear alarmed by Ghazan's scandalous neglect of his father's image and more broadly ancestor worship. So the story raises the question if Ghazan used the pretext of his conversion to Islam and rejection of a Hulaguid commitment of like 40-some years to Buddhism, also to reconfigure the location, access, and ritual administration of Ilkhanid ancestor worship. And we know it continued after, right? But the question is maybe he's kind of moving things around to make sure that nobody else, except for him and other members that he trusts, have access to these sites, which are kind of, again, sort of have the superpower with him. Even if the disruption was temporary or partial, it might have been enough to enable Ghazan to divert ritual and material resources away from competing parties among the Ilkhanid elite and gain control over access to Chinggisi's ancestors and spiritual power. This might have been an initial step towards what will become, under Razan and his brother Uljeto, a new experimentation with fusing Chinggisi's ancestor worship and Islamic traditions of grave visitation and the cult of the saint, of the family of the prophet, actually, into this new kind of perhaps attempt to create a fake mode of shrine-centric kingship. I'm kind of using what Adfer Mu'in's work on this context. I'll stop over here. Thank you so much. Oh, just like one final image I had to bring. I don't know if anyone's going to have this image of succession. I think there's so many commonalities, and I really love this scene from one of the, I hope I'm not ruining the series for anyone, but this final scene from Succession where they're kind of watching the deceased father on the screen, yabbering. It's not even clear what he wants to say, there. And they have all these kind of, the treasure, they're kind of dividing the shares, right? The spoils of the family on the table, and all the siblings there are kind of fighting over the throne. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank and Kaveh, for including me in this wonderful event. And it's great to be in Berkeley, and it's especially great to be in Berkeley in February, because that's a great time to organize workshops and conferences at a time when we don't teach in Germany. We have the sort of long holiday all February and March. And I will also thank my colleagues who took the stage before me for setting the scene for a discussion on interregna or civil wars, etc., because that has been kind of my concern for a long time. We don't, when we look at the European history, we don't set the norms of history by looking at only Napoleon Bonaparte, for instance, right? We consider Napoleon a kind of a moment. But when we work on Mongol history or Timurid history, we look at Chinggis Khan and Timur and etc. We skip the rest as if they just those parts were irrelevant or just a sort of footnote to the bigger narrative. Actually, as Chris Hadfield demonstrated, those periods were much longer and more decisive. So, but the funny thing is, David Armitage a couple of years ago published a wonderful book called The Civil Wars, A History in Ideas. He said that in that book, in many languages, in German and in Chinese and etc., we have many famous treatises on war, like Karl von Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, etc., The Art of War. But we have nothing on the conceptualization of the Civil War. And then he sort of went ahead and wrote that book. It's a fascinating read. I highly recommend if you are interested in these issues. So I will sort of deal with a similar issue. If you look at the general surveys on late medieval Islamic history, usually when they deal with the Timurid dynasty, the succession goes from Timur to Shahrukh. But all historians of the Timurid Empire know very well that this wasn't that straightforward. The Timur died in 1405, and the Shahrukh dispensation established itself in 1421. So there was actually a 16 years long civil war or interregnum, whichever you prefer. My supervisor, John Woods, prefers the term the First Timurid Civil War, or the First Interregnum. There's a second one later in the 15th century, but we won't deal with that today. So what happened during this Timurid Civil War is more or less well known. And in various studies, it was discussed in a detailed manner because we have sort of contemporary and near contemporary sources. The sequence and further details of the events are too long to sort of summarize here, and then there are too many actors that we have to deal with if we take that route. But in this whole story, there is one takeaway, and then there is one puzzle. The takeaway is that Timur favored his second son Jahangir, or the line of Jahangir for succession, for several reasons. One reason, most probably, is Jahangir was born to a free wife, and she also had, her mother had Chingizid connections, and also Muhammad Sultan, the sort of heir designate of Timur, he was one of the oldest Timurid princes at the end of Timur's life. But Muhammad Sultan died before Timur, so during a campaign, and then Pir Muhammad, his half brother, couldn't take his place, because when Timur died, he was too far away from the capital, and he couldn't return on time. So this is the one thing. Timur favored the Jahangir line. But the irony is the Jahangir line never produced any Timurid sovereigns in the 15th century. All other Timurid rulers came from the Miran Shahid and Umar Shahid lines. The puzzle is a bit more difficult to solve, and that's what I will discuss during the rest of my presentation. Now, Shahrukh came to sort of emerged victorious at the end of the First Civil War. But how did that happen? So why did Timur, why did Shahrukh win this competition? So two general views have been expressed to explain Shahrukh's rise to power. According to the first and now largely abandoned view, I should say, Shahrukh came to power, or he won the civil war because he had to. He had no other choice. He didn't do anything, actually. His rivals killed each other, and then Shahrukh at the end said, "Okay, so if nobody is taking the throne, then I will take it." So at the end of a sort of long and bloody civil war, Shahrukh was the only remaining Timurid prince. The Zekiveldi Togan, Bashkir Turkish scholar, Zekiveldi Togan was the sort of the big proponent of that idea. And in his article, he summarizes it in a very nice Turkish sentence. Hadiseler öyle gerektirdi. The events necessitated it. So it's just like he took it. Now, the second view is a bit more complicated and more it's the sort of commonly accepted view now. And then this view mainly comes from the great Russian scholar Vasily Bartold. And Bartold argued that the reason why Shahrukh came to power at the end of the civil war was that the Timurid army or the Timurid emirs supported him. So they didn't support other princes, but they supported Shahrukh. So then Shahrukh had a clear advantage. So the Bartold's hypothesis was studied by subsequent scholars, Shiro Ando and Beatrice Mans, and Ismail Aka, and etc. And this is now the sort of prevailing opinion among the historians of the Timurid Empire. My intention is not to challenge this view, but add a layer of complication, because this view doesn't explain why those Timurid emirs supported Shahrukh. They did not have to, but they chose to support Shahrukh. And why did they do that? So the the question for me is not whether their support was crucial or not. It was obviously a crucial factor, but it is why the emirs decided to support Shah Rukh and not any other member of the Timurid dynasty. After the death of Timur, Shah Rukh was by no means the most favorable candidate. In fact, he was in many respects, the least favorable one in comparison to his rivals. So it is my contention that the solution is in the ideas or in the constitutional programs that each prince pursued during this civil war. It is my contention that the first Timurid civil war was not a mere military power play, but it was also a moment in which different political programs and constitutional ideas competed with each other. And Shah Rukh was the one who sort of formulated the strongest political program and constitutional idea. While drawing upon the economic and military resources that Timur had accumulated during his reign, each Timurid prince during the civil war also articulated diverse constitutional programs in the articulation of their power. So let me briefly review how competing Timurid houses articulated their political programs during the civil war. Unfortunately, just like in the Mongol history, we have this issue of Toluyid bias, sometimes you mention. So we have a similar issue in the Timurid history. We have a Shahrukid bias. We can't know every actor's opinion. But we can sort of still do, I think, a lot with the sources that we have. So Jürgen Pohl, my colleague in Germany, who lives in Hamburg now, Jürgen Pohl discussed the matter in the context of Khalil Sultan's short reign in Samarkand after the death of Timur. You know, just a brief footnote, Timur died during, right at the beginning of his campaign to China. So, unlike Shah Rukh's power base, which consisted of Timurid emirs, Khalil Sultan's army mainly consisted of foreigners, as they are called in our sources, which formed the right wing of Timur's army, marching to China. These foreigners included the Kara Tatars, whom Timur had deported from Anatolia. Some remnants of the Jalayirid dispensation in the Middle East, in Iraq, and then Jauni Kurbani, that is the erstwhile members of the Togay Timurid dispensation in Khorasan in the 14th century. These groups found themselves under Khalil Sultan's command simply because he was the commander of the right wing of the army during the Chinese campaign. Therefore, Khalil Sultan had to rely on a non-integrated army with no strong retinue or the kind of a Nokur system. In the end, Khalil Sultan failed to articulate a coherent political culture connecting such diverse groups around a common goal, and his army gradually disintegrated. So he tried to keep the army together by spending Timur's treasure, because Timur's treasure was in Samarkand and Khalil Sultan was in Samarkand. So he used the money, but at some point the money ran out. He ran out of money, and then the army disintegrated. This doesn't mean, of course, that Khalil Sultan tried to come up with a sort of constitutional program. He appointed one of the members of the Jahangirid family as the nominal sovereign Muhammad Jahangir, the coin you see on the left. And then Muhammad Jahangir even minted coins alone. So this was an attempt to replicate actually the idea of Timurid dual kingship. As you may know, the Timur ruled in the name of a Chingizid sovereign, with the exception of the last 2 years of his life. So we have the Soyurgatmish Khan and Sultan Mahmud Khan, so two Khans that sort of, they were actually seen as the sort of sovereigns of the Timurid Empire. There is a third name, the Sultan Ahmed Khan, but we have his name just on one coin, which is in Mardin Museum today. We don't have any references to him in any other place. So this idea of dual kingship is, as you know, is well established in the Timurid period. Timur used the Chingizid ruler's name on his coins. The greatest Sultan Soyurgatmish, Emir Timur, the son-in-law, or other Timurid princes used the same formula or same constitutional principle as well. This is Miranshah's edict, Sultan Mahmud Khan yarlığından Miranshah Küregen sözümüz, that is by the command of Sultan Mahmud Khan, Miranshah Küregen, our word. And this is a sort of a replication of the Timurid dual kingship idea. There is one sovereign and then the ruler who controls the political authority. This sovereign tends to be a Chingizid, but in the absence of a Chingizid, that role is sort of relegated to God. Because when they didn't have a Chingizid sovereign, the Timurid and Turkmen rulers used the formula al-mulk lillah at the beginning of their edicts, which means the sovereignty belongs to God. If there is a Chingizid, the sovereignty belongs to Chingizid. And the word söz is only used for the political authority holders, and yarlı, hukm, or mulk for the Chingizids, or for God. So we have a bit more informed about other pretender, Iskandar ibn Umar Sheikh. Iskandar Umar Sheikh, we are better informed because he wrote his own treatises. He wrote about his own ideas, so we know what he was actually thinking as a pretender to Timur's throne. So Iskandar, I will just sort of summarize this part because Yoni before me referred to some of the concepts that Iskandar tried to articulate. The Iskandar, by using occult sciences, he tried to cultivate a sacral persona for himself as a sacred king. And then he also tried to be a bit innovative in his constitutional program. For instance, he was the first Mongol and Timurid ruler, to the best of my knowledge, I will be happy to be corrected on this point, who tried to institutionalize the issue or the rule of condominium in the system. He minted coins clearly referring to a condominial political system. This is the coin that I'm referring to. And then the inscription of the coin reads, Sultanan, Sultan Shahrukh Bahadur ve Iskandar Bahadur. So Sultanan is the Arabic dual here. So the coin refers to two equal sovereigns mentioned on the same coin. He even tried to sort of reconcile the Sunni and Shi'i religious positions in his political program. But at the end, when Shahrukh moved to suppress Iskandar's political activities, then Iskandar's armies were no match to Shahrukh's, Shahrukh's army, which is based on Timur's own army. Now, sorry. Now, the question is still there, though. Why did Shahrukh emerge victorious, but why did the emirs, or why did Timur's army support Shahrukh? Usually in previous literature, we kind of ignored Shahrukh's political program because in earlier scholarship he was presented as the good Muslim and sort of he wouldn't have other political programs. Now, I think the solution is in the idea of caliphate. Shahrukh was the first Muslim ruler in the late medieval period who revived the idea of caliphate, and he called himself caliph as a sort of as a sovereign. So we have evidence that Timur used this title between 1405 and 1418, and then we have numismatic evidence that allows us to extend this to 1422. So beyond the civil war. This is one of the coins that includes Timur's Shahrukh's title as caliph, as Sultanul Azam Shahrukh Bahadur Khaladallahu Mulkahu wa Khilafatahu, and later coins replaces Khilafatahu with Sultanatuhu. So why is this significant for Shahrukh? Because the idea of caliphate, or the caliphate as a constitutional program, refers to a power sharing agreement. The idea goes back to this Quranic phrase, Quranic verse, which says, your Lord God brought forth descendants from the loins of Adam's children and made them testify against themselves. And he said, am I not your Lord? They said, we bear witness that you are. This he did, lest you should say on the day of resurrection, we had no knowledge of that. So in Turkish, in Arabic, in Persian, there's a saying, Qalu Bala, since the beginning of the time. That term refers to this phrase. Basically, the community and God entered into a contractual relationship, and community accepted the religion, and God accepted the perpetuity of the community. So in this framework, politics is a bond or a contract between God and humans. And the blueprint of this contract, or mithaq, is the law, that is the Sharia. Human beings are personally obliged to follow the rules of the Sharia in return for the religion that they received from God. In actual terms, in reality, this view of politics manifests itself in the personal relationship between the imam and the community. The imam ensures the implementation of justice, and the community obeys the imam. The power is shared between the king and segments of the society which provided legitimacy to the ruler. In constitutional terms, caliphs were elected, as you may know. It wasn't a hereditary office. The caliphs were elected by the community. So in that sense, the the community is empowered. It is the sort of the sovereignty is invested in the community, not in any other, any other entity. So in the Timurid period, we have Shahrukh's adoption of the caliphate, and this really empowers the Timurid emirs because it allows Shahrukh to enter into a power-sharing agreement with the commanders, so that commanders, or the emirs, if I may use the term, emirs would feel much more comfortable in a new political arrangement. If you look at the other options, other political or constitutional programs, they all propose some type of absolutist rule. And then why should the army commanders accept an absolutist rule if they don't get anything back from the ruler? So in that sense, Shahrukh's program was the much more appealing, or the idea of caliphate was the much more appealing constitutional program for the army. That's why they supported Shahrukh. We have, I will stop soon, we have a sort of a long political treatise, Nasaih Shahrukhi, which basically details these ideas in a very detailed manner. But I should say after the end of the Civil War, Shahrukh's power-sharing program kind of backfired because suddenly those religious scholars started feeling very empowered. And then in the next stage, Shahrukh had to sort of confront the learned classes of Iran and Central Asia. But that's a different story, and I will stop here right now. Thank you very much. Thank you.